It's more of like an amicable discussion, friendly dialogue type of thing rather than a debate.
Yeah.
This is one I hold, yeah?
And
Do you have the fluffy thing?
can't find it. We lost it.
Oh, you lost it, yeah?
Yeah, one second.
Let me know when you're ready.
Well, make sure you
Ali, is there a water bottle down there?
I'll get you. No water.
No, there's a water bottle here.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, start. Maybe introduce another corner again.
Ready? Assalam. Sorry. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Salam Corner. Today I have with me Luca. How are you doing, Luca?
Pretty fine, pretty dandy, not too bad.
Thank you for joining the corner, and we're going to have a discussion about the purpose of life. So firstly, just introduce yourself, why you come to Speaker's Corner, and what do you think the purpose of life is?
I'm Luca, second year university student.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, one more year. I originally came to Speaker's Corner around 7 years ago. So I've been very on and off type thing. So just kind of coming back because the weather's, but also because chance to get into a load of very interesting debates, discussions about life, religion, philosophy, politics, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
What do I think the meaning of life is? Or
Just
purpose
before
of
that,
life?
what do you study at university?
Philosophy and theology
Oh, okay. Sorry to hear that again. Which university is it?
at Oxford.
Oh, okay. So you probably know Alex.
Yeah. We have debates all the time. Actually.
Oh, okay. So are you on the opposing side or the same side?
Yes, I'm on the opposing side. Yeah.
Okay, so you believe in
So
God?
we started off a society together where we debate all these things all the time.
The Oxford Forum?
No, so it's called Socratic Society.
Oh,
where we
yes.
debate, every Friday night. But yeah, so I'm a Christian. So I think, I don't know how I succinctly phrase it, what I think the purpose of life is. I think one more kind of Protestant phrasing of it is to know God and glorify Him forever. I think anything kind of within the sphere of bringing glory to God in how you live your life, not just living like a nice, socially acceptable pattern of moral upright living, but actually knowing God, being in a relation with God, and being fundamentally saved, have your place in heaven, as it were, kind of thing. Yeah, just anything around that sort of.
Okay, so being at Oxford, it's a very leftist place, a lot of very... I grew up in Oxford, so I know about the sort of...
So sorry.
They have this thing about, as long as you're a good person, and the good person is minus God, right? Good just means you're a vegan, you're nice to people, you believe in human rights, and they divorce being goodness from God. So how do you feel about that?
Round of applause.
I've got good legs, I'll be fine.
About it. Carry on.
How do I feel? Okay, so in Oxford, obviously, I think that's a shame because it is meant to be this kind of high bastion of intellectual development, and so that kind of restricts it because it doesn't seem very consistent. Just generally speaking, though, I just don't think that makes much sense. I don't think you have any kind of grounding philosophically or reasonably to say you have any kind of objective binding morality on you to do X, Y, Z if you don't have a proper foundation, which I'd say is God. So
Okay.
I think it's just problematic whichever way you cut it, really.
Okay, good. And earlier you spoke about the debate in Oxford, about morality. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts about morality? Do you think atheists can justifiably believe in an objective morals and objective standards, and human rights can be grounded in an atheistic worldview?
Okay, so I think there are two different questions. So I think the first part about it is objectivity.
Yeah.
I'd say inherently no. If I understood what Alex was saying at that point, I think he was saying you can have a kind of contingent objectivity. So once you've identified the ends which you want to go to, you can identify objective ways in which the best are most conducive in achieving that. But insofar as you're saying just proper objectivity, just simpliciter, then I don't think you can have that on an atheistic worldview.
Okay.
And then regarding human rights, I think again it's the same sort of thing. If you can't have objectively binding human rights, but you can have kind of once you've identified other ends which you link to that, then you can have objective ways to achieve those ends. Kind of thing.
So on the first part of what you said about it being contingent on something, and you can have a sort of subjective objectivity to that, what did you think about that argument?
Sound. I don't see a problem with that. I mean, if it comes down to what would I actually rather follow, like what if I'm going to say objective morality versus subjective or like contingent objectivity, this one obviously has a lot more philosophical and like practically meaning to it.
Yeah.
So obviously I'm going to prefer this one provided it's true. But in terms of just whether that's a sound argument, I think it is a sound argument.
Yeah. And based upon something that we agree upon, or something contingent, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that the argument essentially is about less suffering, right? And human flourishment, essentially. But those very things are, again, axiomatic. They're just things you've taken as axioms, things you can't prove in any way, and you just assume those things and carry on. So the way I feel is that atheists don't realize that, yes, you can have something coherent, you can have something consistent, but that doesn't mean there's a moral oughtness to it. That is something that is binding, that everybody else necessarily has to agree to it. It is something fundamentally which somebody can challenge and come along and say, no, I don't agree with that.
Kind of. I mean, the whole point of the argument is that if it's both sound and true, then you can't really escape from it. So the point is that I'm saying it's internally consistent, but it's not
But
true.
if you accept the assumptions, that's what I mean.
Yeah, so if you accept the assumptions, I think so. The question goes. So then, okay. So let's look at one of the assumptions. So the assumption is kind of coming up from a very utilitarian perspective of the two sovereign principles of pain and pleasure type thing.
But if they are sovereign, that's the point.
Yeah. So the point is that it then comes down to whether we question that axiomatic assumption type thing. I think it has a lot of weight. I don't think it's ultimately true. I think it has a lot of weight evidentially and is very plausible.
But under an atheist worldview, would you still say that it's something coherent and it's watertight?
Well, okay, so under an atheist worldview, I'm not even sure then, because if you're going to push it extreme, I think you don't just get moral nihilism, but you get rational nihilism, which is arguably even more problematic in the sense that if you have, so the problem with kind of an atheistic worldview, if it leads to nihilism of morality and it leads to nihilism of rationality, you can't even trust your own reasoning processes to kind of undergo this philosophical reasoning, right?
Yeah.
The issue though, which you can then kind of counteract that is that they assume basic axioms from which they go on to reason and they can operate within that sphere, right?
Yeah. And that, I think, and sorry to cut you off, but that I think needs some theological ground. So I think C.S. Lewis has this saying that when he was an atheist, he used to think about the universe being unjust.
What was the line to which he...
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the missing link here.
Okay, so I agree, but this kind of comes down to how we're defining axioms.
Yeah.
Because if we're understanding an axiom in its like proper sense, then an axiom is just, it's kind of like a proper basic belief. You can't go any further than it. So this kind of comes down to the whole kind of presuppositional framework where a theist may presuppose God, which can then explain ontological reality as we have it, creation and so on, and our rationality and morality and so on. But an atheist, it seems that they could also presuppose, say, a couple of other axioms, like just their own rationality, existence as it appears to them, as it can be, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not quite sure how to critique that if it is just an axiom which they're taking. We could go back and forth and be like, you shouldn't accept that axiom, you should accept this axiom, but it's too fundamental to dispute evidentially.
So Luca, right, so about this, you're very right that if someone says, look, this is a properly basic belief and it's axiomatic, that it's hard to simply say to them, no, you can't have a basic belief because we all have basic beliefs. However, the point which I try and get the atheists to admit is that they have a belief which is basic, which they didn't arrive at using their reason. Because many of the neo-atheist arguments are rationality is the first primary thing, and all of our beliefs are based upon reason. And you can't say that and believe in basic beliefs at the same time, because there's a contradiction there.
Explain the contradiction.
So if you accept the idea of a properly basic belief, axiomatic belief, that means it's not something you rationally justified, right? Exactly. And the neo-atheist narrative of the Dawkinites, of the Hitchens, of these guys is everything is rationalized. We don't take anything for granted. We're pure skeptics. And there's a contradiction between these two narratives.
Okay, I can imagine there would be a contradiction there. I think it wouldn't be as problematic if you presupposed your reason as an axiom and then from there said, okay, not that it will yield absolute certainty, but we can have what we should be doing and how we should operate through life, accepting beliefs, rejecting beliefs, should always be done through the lens of reason. As I'm arguing from an atheist worldview now, it should always be done through the lens of reason rather than revelation. I don't see something inherently contradictory with that, because their axiom they've just presupposed, they're not saying reason is the absolute truth and that's the only thing, but they're saying that once you presuppose your own reason and faculties, then from there you should subject everything to reason.
Yeah.
I think that seems quite...
Yeah, it does, but that's if they say this is my presupposition.
Yeah. So I think a lot...
And the new atheists, they don't like to admit that they have presuppositions. That's the problem.
Yeah, so that's probably the biggest problem, is that they're not actually acknowledging where they're making certain axiomatic presuppositions, they're not acknowledging where they have quote-unquote faith in certain necessary assumptions. Although I think if you meet certain atheists who are coherent and consistent and admit that point, it's then harder to kind of dispute past that. I think,
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to dispute with them because what they're basically doing is they're saying this is my axiom and I'm carrying on.
Yeah.
Right? And I have no problem as long as they are open about it, because what I can turn around as a Muslim or you as a Christian, Luca, can say is, well, I also have my presuppositions. So if I have presuppositions, you can't say I'm irrational, because you also have presuppositions. I think the entire problem with, and I don't think Alex falls into this so much, but more the other atheists, like Krauss and others, who are refused to admit there's any assumptions or presuppositions involved in their worldview. They think it's all derived from reason, pure reason.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, so on to another point that you said about human rights, right? Now, one of the things I was arguing for in the debate is that human rights, especially the Western conception of human rights that we have in the Western world, this is just a corpse of Christianity. This didn't come from an atheistic worldview. What's your thoughts on this?
I mean, I haven't read up enough historically around it, but I would, from what I've heard and just kind of understand, especially when you take it from kind of an American perspective as well, like in the Constitution and so on, I can see a lot of just Judeo-Christian grounding for the ideas of human rights. Although I would say that especially in the current day, we have a lot of baggage, as it were, a lot of kind of influence that is still coming from Enlightenment thinking, which it ended up having to still rely on certain Christian theistic axioms, even though it wouldn't admit it. But by and large, how they practically conducted it, they were doing it separate to religion, and they still kind of argued for these things of human rights. So especially someone like Mill. I could largely agree that it does have to have its kind of historical grounding in Judeo-Christian thoughts.
And you know, Douglas Murray, although he's an atheist, he also says something very interesting in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, that human rights has become into the sort of religion, and people are not really certain of its beginning. But in reality, it's a manifestation of the Christian dream. You know, this idea that we have inherent rights and we have these types of things. And interestingly now, a lot of the cases for human rights are being used against the Christian world, right? And being used to critique the Christian world, which is ironic because that was the very genesis of this idea in the Western world.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is fallacious when you start you critique something which you're having to presuppose in order to make that argument in the first place.
Okay, so about faith, and I want to get on to obviously Islam and Christianity in a bit, but about faith, of course, you must have seen in Oxford there's a rise of atheism. There's a lot of people who are inclined towards that. At the same time, I've seen some people turn back to Christianity or turn back to Islam from atheism. Do you think there's a trend now where new atheism is dying and people are turning back to religion? Do you think we're seeing a change now?
Yeah, I would say so. I think a lot of people have become quite practically disillusioned with the narrative that the new atheist worldview kind of espouses. It just doesn't account for their lived experience. It doesn't kind of plug in actual, deep gaps in their heart which they're having to grapple with. Whether that then means that they kind of emotionally then just go and grasp at anything, which can also be a bit of a problem. I think that kind of explains a lot of big thinkers and like speakers like Jordan Peterson and so on, where they
I was about to mention him.
Yeah, so like it makes sense in this kind of vacuum why these ideas have a lot of traction, because they tap into this kind of lack that people have found. Whether it's true or not is a really separate question, but it is very understandable. And I have seen it. I've definitely seen people who, at the very least, are curious. They want to hear a kind of better narrative than the one that they've held to and is being pumped quite widely around.
The way I see it is new atheism is attractive at a certain age and for a certain intellect. But as soon as you get past that, the arguments that Jordan Peterson puts forward. I mean, I don't agree with him with what some of the things he says about Islam, but the other things that he says about nihilism is exactly on point. I mean, I understand why new atheism can lead to depression. New atheism can lead to a sense of meaninglessness, and it doesn't really have anything to offer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to now Islam. What do you know about Islam, and what do you think about the differences between Islam and Christianity?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a huge subject to say what I know about Islam. To be fair, a lot of it is stuff that I have known and then forgotten, so that's problematic in one level. But
well, you're studying philosophy, so I'm guessing you came across some Islamic theologians.
Well, so I picked an Islam and classical Islamic studies.
Interesting.
But it was very interesting. A lot of it was looking at the kind of philosophy and medieval philosophy in Islam. Obviously, really interesting, really enjoyed it. But it wasn't so much the kind of systematic theology approach, looking at doctrines, Tawheed versus Trinity, that kind of stuff, which is more I'm interested in. By and large, I kind of understand the gist of that. Islam comes, depending on how you define Islam, Islam formally with Muhammad and so on comes after Christianity, just historically speaking. A lot of Muslims would understand that actually Islam, in the sense of the word, and being a Muslim, is a kind of much more universal principle. It could be someone who would be a perhaps professing Christian but not really understanding properly. They could still be Muslim. The prophets in the past would be Muslims because they submitted to one God and understood that.
You know a lot.
That kind of stuff. And there's obviously, between Christianity and Islam, there are like key differences. So
Yep.
Trinity versus Tawheed. Did Jesus really die on the cross? Was Jesus divine? Biblical scriptures. Did Jesus rise from the dead? How salvation? Blah blah blah. Lots of things. There's a lot of crossover, but a lot of things. Yeah.
Okay, so about your own faith, were you always a Christian, or did you arrive at Christianity?
So I became a Christian when I was about 15 or 16.
That's usually the time people are thinking of other stuff.
I kind of grew up going to a church, not necessarily from a really Christian background, but grew up going to a church, knew a lot of the principles and ideas, didn't really adhere to it properly, and then kind of just, by and large, kind of acknowledged, just to be consistent on an intellectual level, if this is true, then I have to be living differently. That was just an intellectual belief. And then there's much more the kind of practical experience of, knowing God, having a relationship, being born again, that type of thing. That kind of all came in around the same time, and then after that was when I started investigating Christianity further.
Okay. Luca, that's quite interesting, because normally when I speak to ex-Christians or people become atheists, it's usually around the age of 15 that they leave Christianity.
Yeah.
And they come to Christianity perhaps, like that gentleman over there with the beard, I'm not sure if you can see him. He's standing up on that with the blue shirt. So he's a former militant atheist, actually. I've spoken to him before, and he became a Christian, right? And what's interesting, I just want to share something. So I was speaking to him about Christianity, and he said that he was addicted to pornography. And I don't mind saying this on camera, because obviously he spoke to me about this and he's open, that he was addicted and he felt guilty. He felt sinful. So he turned to Christianity to look for salvation, to look for forgiveness, right? So you have people like him who turn to Christianity or Christians, atheists who become Muslims later on in their 20s. You did it quite early. What was the cause of that?
I mean, if I was a Calvinist, I could say God then drew me to it. I'd say it was a lot of things. It was on the rational, intellectual side, kind of just, for a short period of time, I kind of grappled with just atheism and kind of the rabbit hole that would lead me down, and nihilism, and just thinking.
Quite an early age for that.
Yeah, I kind of just bopped on to what this would actually mean. And so I guess in one part there was like spiritual or emotional motivation that I don't necessarily want to adhere to a worldview where I can literally just go around stealing, murdering, raping, and it doesn't.
And life is meaningless.
Yeah, and like, why don't I just smash up something and go talk to a chicken? Like, why don't I just live completely absurdly, right? When you just push it to its extreme.
Yeah.
So there was that, obviously. There was kind of.
But that seems quite attractive. I mean, one of the things I speak about is that atheism is the is the opiate for the misguided. It gives you this moral freedom to basically do what you want, and at that age, sometimes that's That's very attractive, yeah.
That is very attractive. I understand that. But I
Like
think,
girls, drugs, women.
yeah. I think also probably because coming around to that age, like I'm not gonna lie and say like, oh, I was a really bad boy, but like I'd sinned enough, or at least because I had some sort of Christian upbringing, I was more acutely aware that these are problematic. So it was a lot of it was my conscience kind of speaking out against me, or God kind of with my conscience speaking out against me, telling me these things are really not okay, just because society condones whatever. It's not
In
okay.
Islam, we call them fitra.
Yeah.
You know about that, yeah?
Vaguely, I know the concept.
Yeah. See, your innate disposition.
Yeah. So a lot of it was that, and it was kind of around that age. I also started reading the Bible for myself rather than just listening to what I was told in church kind of thing. So I started reading the Bible for myself, and it was a lot more. When you're in church listening to someone preach to you, you can kind of distribute responsibility of the message, right? When you're just reading something one-to-one and you just have to grapple with it there, I then had to deal with the full weight of it. So it's kind of the positive side of the grace of God, the mercy of God, all that kind of stuff. But then the serious side of you're
Fire
a
and
sinner,
brimstone.
wrath of God, all that kind of stuff. And all of that kind of hemming me into repenting and turning and trusting in God.
Sure.
Kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now, when it comes to Islam, now we as Muslims, we believe that there's one God and that Jesus didn't die on the cross. He's not God's son. He's not divine. He's a human messenger, and he worshipped God, right? Ultimately worshipped God. So how do you reconcile the idea that even you as a Christian, you do believe that Jesus worshipped God, essentially, right? He did acts of worship.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that with the idea that he is divine?
Okay, so I think it would depend in some ways how we're defining worship here. I think on one level, if you link in like praying, for example, I think we can. So on one level, there's the answer that okay, Jesus in his incarnate form, 33 years, he decided to submit himself, and in that sense, he occupied a state which therefore he would venerate the Father from that kind of lower position.
So you believe Jesus is lesser than the Father?
No, I don't say he is in principle less than the Father, but he submitted himself for a finite period of time in order, whatever, as in for the fulfillment of prophecies and to save people, all that kind of stuff. There's also just the general point that praying to God, I think, doesn't necessarily insinuate kind of your respective ontological status. So I don't think Jesus praying to God, therefore you say, oh, God's the higher one, Jesus the lower one, right? Because I think if you understand prayer, especially in terms of communication and relationship and that type of thing, then that's not necessarily, it doesn't implicate ontological like stuff either way, it's nothing, right? So
Well, I would say it does, because you're essentially submitting, like you said.
Yeah.
You're saying there's an authority greater than me,
Yeah.
essentially. Like where we both agree is, in terms of the purpose of life, is to worship God. We both agree with that. The conception God is different, but you see, Islam,